Jordan, how's it going?
Hi guys, always a pleasure. What's up?
Well, we're happy to have you as always, and excited to talk about obviously a Mariners team that is looking to potentially take a series from the Yankees, something that didn't feel likely in Game 1 of this battle. But I got to start with the news. Obviously, Bryce Miller headed to the IL. We did get a relatively encouraging update this morning. Bump and I sat down with Justin Hollander, and he said that this isn't like a lengthy thing. He is scheduled to come back after that 15-day stint, so that's good. But I mean, Jordan, it feels like blow after blow for the Mariners right now. I have no idea how they work through the injuries they have to their starting rotation. What was your reaction to this one?
Yeah, it's disappointing. I think what Bryce has been kind of dealing with this year is a reminder of just how nuanced the conversation is about what to expect from pitchers, right? This isn't a situation where his velocity was necessarily down considerably throughout all starts, but you would see it kind of dip at occasional times. And injuries like this, regardless of the severity, kind of impact different pitchers differently. And he admitted it. He's been very open that he just hasn't felt right and he hasn't looked right. I mean, the regression that has happened with him in terms of strike throwing is, I think, the most concerning trend. I mean, of course, the ERA kind of speaks for itself, but Bryce Miller dominated the zone last year, and that has obviously not been the case so far this season. So, I mean, if we spin it forward, it just really highlights how important guys like Brian Wu are, and really going into today, guys like Luis Castillo are to really kind of step up at a time when this rotation has obviously been thinned out a bit.
There were some, I guess, questionable decisions made last night by Dan Wilson. Stacey and I were talking about it, and it was covered up by a walk-off win from JP. What do you make of the pinch hits, the bunts, the way that he's managing this team?
Yeah, you know, these are the games where certainly any sort of close game like this, certainly a high-profile game against the Yankees where you just kind of have more eyeballs on it. It feels like higher stakes, even though, of course, we are still in the middle of May. But that's where you get exposed is not the right word, but that's where your managerial tendencies and your preferences and your goals and your priorities, that is where they are kind of laid bare, right? Because when you're in a one-run game like that, when you are trying to navigate around certain parts of the lineup, when you only have certain relievers that you trust, you're going to find out kind of what the manager believes about certain players and certain pitchers in certain spots. And there were certainly some moments there where you definitely kind of scratch your head. You do still have to take a step back and just remember also just like the personnel that he is working with. There are some times where it's like, well, yeah, that's his best option in this spot. So while I agree with you, there were definitely some moments where I was like, ooh, this feels dangerous. We know it worked out. There have been a few wins like that this season that have worked out in that respect. But a game like that, you certainly are going to learn a lot about the manager.
Jordan, I can't remember who it was. It might have been you that said this happens to be a roster where there's a lot of decision factors. I'm trying to remember who we were speaking to. But he was talking about how when it comes to pinch hitting or some of these things that we're questioning about Dan or whatever, that the Mariners roster has maybe it was Jason, has a lot of decision points. And I remember making a mental note going, well, what kind of roster is that? So I'll throw you the question then, someone who also knows a ton about baseball. When you're thinking about a roster that has a lot of decision points, what kind of roster is that?
Yeah, so it's kind of a tough question to answer at this stage because of all the injuries, right? I mean, most managers will tell you up front, like, yeah, I'd rather have 9 everyday players, and then that's what I'm working with. But there are also some teams, like, I think I've referenced them before on the show when we've talked about versions of this, is teams like Detroit, where everybody fully buys into what they're doing. And sometimes that does mean getting pinch hit for, even if you're one of the best hitters like Kerry Carpenter. Sometimes that does mean sitting in situations where you normally wouldn't. I think what we've seen with this team this year is partially due to all the injuries. Like, they really have leaned into Ben Williamson as an everyday player, right? They seems like they really are just going to roll with Leody Taveras as an everyday player. Some of that is the belief in the player. Some of that is the product of injuries. And so it's kind of hard to tell just how many, as you mentioned, like how many buttons you're going to press, particularly on the position player side, until everybody's healthy. But I do think that there have definitely been some spots where you can tell there's maybe a push and pull of, is this someone that we want to get every at-bat in every game, or when are we, pushing the button to pinch hit. But the reality is right now, like, especially with the struggles of guys like Solano, guys like Garver, and even Tellez outside of a few swings, there haven't been that many situations where you're that eager to get them in the games.
We were talking to Hollander, and I asked him if there were any surprises or something he's most proud of when it comes to this roster. And the first name he put out there was Dylan Moore. He says, look, he allows me to sleep easy at night because of all the things that he can do. When you compare him to other utility players, where does he rank in your book?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that Dylan Moore is someone this season, as he, I believe, approaches free agency, as I think somebody that is going to get a lot more attention as he kind of, enters the space where other teams could be considered, you could be interested in keeping him around. I'm sure Seattle would love to have him. Maybe they managed to work out an extension, they already have before. But he has really shown a level of versatility, and certainly this year, a level of offensive impact that we've certainly seen in spurts over the course of his career. But when you combine that with being able to be an impact base runner, an impact defender, it's a hell of a thing to have around. And there's not, you sort of see versions of this on every team, but Dylan Moore, to me, what's as compelling about him as anything is just how long he's been around, right? I mean, for him to a guy who they signed to a major league deal before he ever played a major league game, the org exhibited real trust in him in many respects over the years. And in a year like this, when you have had so many injuries, I can understand why Justin Hollander feels that way about him.
Trade deadline talk is still a ways away. And while we're eager to get to that with you in a couple months, it is probably a little early for this conversation. So instead, just kind of a setting the stage type question. When you're looking at this Mariners roster right now, are you starting to see some holes open up? Are you starting to have new questions about the roster that you didn't before? You know what I mean? Like, as we start to inch towards that trade deadline type of how do you patch the holes, where are you seeing some of those holes form on this roster?
Yeah, I think we know that I sort of referenced this either last week or the week before, that since the offense on the whole has been performing so well, it's been a lot easier to overlook some of the spots that are undeniably weak, whether that is Ben Williamson is an awesome story, and I hope that, I think he'll be a good major league player in the long run. Offensively right now, I know he had a hit last night in a big spot, but offensively right now, you're not getting a lot out of that spot as a third baseman. Now again, they're not necessarily asking him to anchor the lineup, but when you combine that with also how little you're getting out of first base, those are two spots that are not usually that low on the production in your lineup. So offensively, I have to imagine those are two spots that stand out. But at this point, especially with this latest news, you do have to wonder if starting pitching is going to be a priority, because maybe Emerson Hancock can continue to prove himself as a capable back-end guy. Maybe George Kirby's back soon and Logan Gilbert's back soon and Bryce Miller's back as soon as they hope. But, that second level right now is just not there. With all due respect to Jonathan Diaz, and we'll see what Logan Evans can continue to do in his opportunities. It's funny, right? This is the last team. We've seen these past deadlines. The Mariners are the last team. They have to look at all these other teams and be like, oh boy, you're spending all this on pitching. And of course, the last time they did it was Luis Castillo, and that worked out great. Could you see them going for a similar pitcher like that, right? At the start of the season, you would never expected them to be going after a Sandy Alcantara or whatever. But as ridiculous as that sounds, I think they have to consider all options. It's still a little bit early to understand what starting pitching is going to be available. But the depth's been eaten in, and welcome to the real world in terms of keeping your pitchers healthy in 2025. It doesn't usually go as smoothly as it did last year, and I think that they are probably starting to reckon with that and consider all options there.
This is, I guess, is more of just a human question here. What mentally, what do you think a series win against the Yankees does for this team, especially coming off of a sweep to the Blue Jays?
Yeah, I think constantly early on this season, and this applies to really all the American League, is just kind of where do you stack up? And not just because the Yankees, won the pennant last year, but they have been one of the most consistent besides Detroit, the most consistent team in the American League. Now they've certainly had some low points, and there are certainly some big questions that you can have about that roster too. But on the whole, I will say, I definitely, and this is not just because of what happened, I should say 2 nights ago, but I definitely understood sold the Yankees lineup around Aaron Judge to a certain degree, and that's because of guys like Trent Grisham. That's because of guys like Paul Goldschmidt, who are having really, really, really good seasons. Some of their younger players, of course, Ben Rice, a big story. Like, on the whole, this is still a great lineup, even around Aaron Judge. But Judge is still the one that you're dealing with. And so far, they have, for the most part, neutralized him, which has been impressive. But like I said, it's just kind of where do you stack up, because the American League does still feel extremely wide open. And because of that, any opportunity to kind of show where you fit. We're seeing this right now in Detroit with the Tigers against the Red Sox. I think this is another example of kind of the Mariners having an opportunity to kind of show where they stand. And the first game of this series it showed one thing, and I think the second game kind of showed another.
Obviously, 95 and in early 90s era into the 2000 Mariners excluded, like that brick of success. I can understand why so many Mariners fans over the last 20-odd years, Jordan, are always hesitant to buy into a fun start or buy into a fun season. And the sentiment around the Mariners tends to be they will always be stuck where they are. Like, it's just kind of what it is, right? However, I don't think that means that the flavor of each season has always been the same. I think sometimes there is a more fair reason for optimism, or there is, kind of a different feel to the team. So answer honestly. I'm not saying like predict the Mariners deep into the playoffs, but does this version of the Mariners, and you can include some of the guys that they have as a whole, right, the nucleus they have, feel more competitive, feel different, feel like something to have more optimism around to you compared to past iterations?
Yeah, it's so hard. I think that obviously you'd prefer not to have all these pitching injuries, and you'd rather run it back with this flawless 5 of, best rotation in baseball, all these great things. But it was pretty obvious coming into the season that last year was probably the outlier from a durability and just overall everything come together standpoint. So you had to recognize that there was going to be some regression in that stance. Now, it's maybe gone a little bit more extreme in the other direction as you would certainly plan for. But I say all that as a kind of a prelude to say that, like, they've been forced to figure it out in other ways. They've been forced into finding other ways to win, outscoring the opponent instead of winning. I know last night was different because last night felt more of like a vintage Mariners win that we've grown really used to them seeing, but we've also seen them win some slugfests, and that is something that they've had to adapt to. That is something that maybe is the product of the new, hitting group, because the personnel isn't necessarily that different. And in that sense, it's more compelling. Does that mean it's more successful? Does that mean it's something that is still that you're going to trust in the long run? I think the best case scenario is that you have some of those elements in place if and when they do get to the postseason. And then if you're hopefully by then, you do still have frontline arms to turn to that everybody has talked about. Because for the past few years, it's like, oh, well, if they get in, then they can turn to those starting pitchers and then win a bunch of 1-0 games in the postseason. Well, maybe the starting pitching isn't as good as it has been the years past, but if Logan Gilbert is back in that second half, if you do still have this version of Brian Wu or an improved version of Luis Castillo, you have those, and then you also have an offense that is not as much of a laughingstock as it was the last few years. And so you're kind of going to have to combine some of the best elements of your team, and the best version of that team can absolutely win this division and make some noise in the postseason. But the downfall, like the lower parts now with these injuries, are still pretty low and pretty concerning, and pitfalls that cannot be ignored. And maybe they'll be addressed via trade. Maybe they'll be addressed via guys getting healthy. But there are definitely still reasons to be worried about this team. But I think that what they've demonstrated is real upside that there is worth being excited about.
With everything that's going on with the rotation, all the injuries, we're seeing less quality starts out of these guys, and that puts more stress on the bullpen. Where do you think the bullpen stands right now as far as talent, execution? Give me another report card.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was thinking about this a lot watching last night, because I know it took a few extra innings, but for the first time, that really did look. I know there were some moments there where you're like, oh, is it here? Spire to Brash to Munoz, like that kind of feels like the recipe, right? That's kind of what they've been building towards. That's the bullpen. Now, of course, if you go back to spring training, I'm sure they thought and hoped that Santos would be part of that conversation too. We know how disappointing and frustrating that experience was to the start of the season, but with how good Spire has looked, And with Brash kind of being back in the mix, and it's clear Brash is not back to his full self. Like, his breaking ball looks as good as ever. The fastball is still doesn't quite have that giddy up that it did when he was at his best, and that's fine. That's totally to be expected. Other than that, Vargas has been generally pretty impressive. They definitely still need another couple guys to feel like you can really trust them. We've seen that with Colin Snyder at times, certainly last year. This year, not as much. We know Thornton has sort of fallen off. Legumina has had some moments. Bizzardo is a little bit more low leverage. They still feel a guy or two short, but in a game where maybe you have a bigger lead, that Spire to Brash to Munoz, like that kind of feels like what they're going for in their most important games, and that's pretty good. But you can't do that every night, and that does also require your starter to be really good. So it's there, but they still probably need a little bit more depth there to feel a little bit better. And I'd be curious if we do see some of those guys from Tacoma at some point, whether that's a Fujinami, whether that's a Will Klein, some guys like that.
Yahoo Sports has the latest power rankings for MLB from Jordan Shusterman. And Jordan, on the latest episode of Baseball Barbiecast, tell listeners what they can expect.
Yeah, so, of course, the other massive news, of course, coming earlier this week involving MLB reinstating Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson. Our episode today covers that pretty in-depth, so you can listen to our conversation about that. But also, Tuesday night was just like one of the great regular season days of baseball we've had in a long time, with 5 walk-offs, the Mariners, of course, being one of them. So a lot of on-the-field stuff that was super fun to talk about as well.
Again, Baseball Barbiecast, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.